When One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, written by Ken Casey, was published in 1962, mental hospitals were much different than what they are today. This story sheds light on shocking treatments of those interred in mental hospitals through the eyes of the narrator, Chief, a 6'7" Native American man who is assumed to be both deaf and dumb by the staff, and through the actions of McMurphy, a rowdy and boisterous man who has recently been interred and pled insanity rather than serving a work sentence at a farm. During the 1900s, those who were admitted into mental asylums were those who didn't quite fit into society. The typical asylum was dirty, poorly kept, and got very little funding from the government. The treatments that were administered did nothing to help the patients. Rather, it hurt them. Patients were treated with electroshock treatment, which more often broke the patient's back than provide mental healing, and were submerged in cold baths and forced to stay there for hours. Though these institutions were meant to be for short-term stays, many patients were interred for years or even decades before they would die from their treatments. The doctors would prescribe addictive medicines that would unknowingly produce hallucinative effects and would sedate the patients rather than help them through their problems. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest gives readers a closer look into mental institutions of the time, not only through the narration and main protagonist, but by showing the insane treatments applied by those in charge of the asylums.
The person in charge of the asylum in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a lady named Big Nurse. Described as a cold and heartless tyrant, she's a staunch supporter of the asylum. We're lucky to be allowed into the asylum in order to interview Big Nurse. What do you believe is the best course of action for those interred in your institution?
I think that those who are admitted into my institution are needing help that they cannot anywhere else get. These patients are not suited to be part of the regular world, and need to be specially treated in order to be released and become normal. I think that by keeping them on a strict schedule, limiting their contact with the outside world, and administering specific treatment when all else fails is the best course of action.
What made you believe that becoming a nurse in a mental asylum was something you should do?
I think that there are many poor, unfortunate souls who cannot fit into society, and what better place for them than a place for people like them. Here in our institutions, the doctors, helpers, and I are able to keep a close eye on them and help them get through their illness. Even if it seems impossible, we will keep them here and continue to treat them for as long as necessary, even if that means that they are interred here forever.
For decades, mental institutions have existed for many different reasons. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the mental hospital that everybody is in is an institution that reflects what would be common in the 1960s. The patients were not treated properly, and they did not get the help they needed. While there were alternative methods discussed in the 1920s and 30s, institution inhabitants continued to rise through the 50s and 60s. The deinstitutionalization movement began in the 1980s when President Ronald Reagan cut funds to mental institutions in order to provide more funds to other programs.
Which, unless they represent a threat to someone else, we're helpless to put them in an institution where they would receive the best of care and certainly have fine quarters and be fed and all.
Before then, John F. Kennedy and Jimmy Carter had signed legislation to help those in mental institutions seek better help and more programs to cure them. However, because of the repeal of Jimmy Carter's act by Reagan, institutions were shut down all over the country, as well as the programs that went with them. Now, patients often seek community-based help, which doesn't always work, and in 2012, there was a massive surge in mentally ill patients in prisons. While there are a few who support the institutions themselves, there is one person who has come forth recently to speak his mind. President Donald Trump believes mental institutions, specifically ones like in the past, is the sole solution to the gun problem in America.
Part of the problem is we used to have mental institutions, and I said this yesterday. We had a mental institution where you take a sicko like this guy. He was a sick guy, so many sides, and you'd bring him to a mental health institution. Those institutions are largely closed because communities didn't want them. Communities didn't want to spend the money for them. So you don't have any intermediate ground. You can't put him in jail because he hadn't done anything yet, but you know he's going to do something.
This is something that is a factor for sure, but there is no proof to recommend that this is a fact. Mental institutions may not be the sole solution, but bringing back psychiatric programs could help immensely. They would help treat severely ill patients, and they can live together with others. Mental Health America is the nation's leading community-based nonprofit organization dealing with mental health, and one of many organizations showing their support for psychiatric programs. They believe that when no better action can be taken to improve someone's mental condition, hospitalization through a program is an effective way to do so. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association is another great example of an organization that advocates for proper treatment of those with mental illness, and they believe that psychiatric programs led by families and peers are vital. If there was a middle ground between all three big ideas, such as institutions with embedded programs, our country could benefit greatly, perhaps more than people think.
When Ken Casey published the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1962, the effectiveness of mental institutions was heavily questioned and debated and questioned throughout the United States and the world.
Hello, we are here with the chief from the mental ward. How you doing?
I'm great today.
Starting off with some questions. While you were in the mental hospital, what did you realize about how society thought of and dealt with mental problems?
So in the 1960s, when I was in the heart of my treatment, I saw a change in how people like myself were being treated. In past decades, I was able to recognize that I was in an asylum-type place and that there was a problem in overcrowding in these facilities. There was a shift that occurred in the National Mental Health Association, and they decided that it was in the best interest of everyone to start deinstitutionalization. They saw a benefit in getting rid of more patients, but didn't realize its negative implications.
All right. What kind of therapy or treatments were you provided with, and how effective do you think they were?
Well, honestly, I don't really think they were that effective because I saw some patients when they were released from the hospitals, and they were expected to easily fall back into society, but that just wasn't realistic. They needed a continuous form of assistance that they were not receiving, and I heard that most of them went on to be either unemployed or homeless. The treatment and understanding that society has of our conditions during this period of time is not sufficient in helping those recover and move past their mental illnesses. And then moving on, when the deinstitutionalization occurred, the types of treatments also shifted in a way. So while I was admitted, we still saw the common needles, the shock therapy, and I vividly remember the continuous psychotherapy that went on in that hospital. And along with these, the one that will remain in my mind forever, I believe, is the hydrotherapy because of all the discomfort it brought me.
Well, man, that sounds awful. Honestly, it sounds like a terrible experience, really. Could you give me an example of a treatment that actually resonated with you?
Yeah, just going back to the hydrotherapy, because it was so intense and I was just not a big fan. We would just go to the pool inside the hospital that we were all admitted to, and the purpose of it was to bring us comfort, to calm us down, to kind of treat our illnesses. But it didn't really do that for me at all because I had some trouble with water for some reason. And going off that, I believe mental hospitals should really try and focus on each patient as an individual and not as groups that you can just treat all at once.
Today, we are allowed the opportunity to interview psychiatric patient Randall McMurphy. When this Korean War veteran was found guilty of statutory rape, he pled insanity to avoid a prison sentence in favor of a mental ward. I'm about to give him a call right now. Let's hope he picks up. Hello, is this for that interview they wanted me to do? Hello, Randall, sir. Please call me McMurphy. Right, so McMurphy, this is for an interview. Would you mind if I ask you some personal questions? Nothing about that whole rape case, but other than that, I'm an open book. Go on. Splendid. After quite a bit of research on your present situation, I became increasingly curious as to why you declined a prison sentence in favor of an incalculable and therefore unregulated stay in a mental ward. Listen, have you ever been to prison before? Most definitely not, sir. If only you knew, man. They treat you like filth, slime, sludge, subhuman garbage. These knuckleheads don't feed you right either. And the inmates, they haven't seen the light of day for years, decades at most. They'd kill you out of desperation, entertainment. Ain't no way you make it out of that can. I'd give you a week before you break. Sounds awful, Mac, but may I ask, what's so much better about a mental ward? For one, they feed you right. Full course meals, scrambled eggs, juice, milk. You eat like a king, and in life, that's how you survive. Me, I'm a survivor, prisoner of war camp, Korean War vet. I get through it. I realize that your contribution to the protection of America is noble, but fail to recognize how a weaselly lie about mental illness parallels this admirable act in an attempt to justify your actions as that of a survivor. Huh? Are you mentally ill? Did that contribute to your compulsion to rape? She consented. No further questions. I'm done with this. McMurphy, Mac, are you there? Well, folks, it looks like my humble inquisitions frightened our guest. Very well, then. Although McMurphy's decision to stay in a mental ward for an indeterminable amount of time rather than going through a short prison sentence may seem odd and unfortunate, this practice isn't uncommon. A famous example of this situation occurred in 1859 when General Daniel Sickles pled insanity in court after killing Philip Barton Key, who was having an affair with his wife Teresa. This tactic worked effectively, and Sickles was acquitted of his murder charges. Although Sickles got out free, McMurphy might not be so lucky. The head nurse at the ward, Nurse Ratched, informed me that he has no say in when he will be freed back into society. As the sole regulator of McMurphy's fate, she maintains complete control. Sounds like McMurphy picked comfort over foreseeable freedom. Well, I'm not here to judge.
Changes in mental institutions had to occur simply because of how poorly the patients were being treated. People with mental illnesses were treated with absolutely no respect. They were locked away in tiny cells to keep shame from their families, and straitjackets were used to restrain them. Methods of torture were even used, such as locking patients in wooden cages for months, giving them ice-cold showers, binding them to chairs, waterboarding them, starvation, being forced to sit in searing hot water for hours, being beaten for not working or listening to staff, head dunking, and finally being chained and stamped in the face. As you can clearly see, this immoral, inhumane, and absolutely horrendous treatment had to be changed immediately. Thankfully, in today's day and age, mental health institutions treat their patients much better than in the past. Patients get to wear casual clothes, and it's no longer like a jail where people are locked in small cages for months at a time. Each patient has their own room, punishments are tame, visitors are welcome to come in and bring their loved ones anything they like, and the treatment is actually effective and doesn't harm anyone. Torture, obviously, is no longer prevalent in mental hospitals. Institutions started changing in the 1960s through 1970s after a medical breakthrough. People began to realize how to properly treat mental illness. After that, many old mental asylums closed down and new and improved ones opened up. People go to mental institutions for a variety of reasons, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and clinical depression. But there are two primary reasons a person is admitted into an inpatient mental health facility. They are either a threat to themselves, suicide, or physical harm, or they are a threat to others. I believe there are many ways to help those who have a mental illness and aren't easily treated. To begin with, it depends on the severity of the person who needs to be treated. If they are a threat to themselves and to others and cannot be controlled in any way, they should be immediately sent to a 24-hour care center where they can be treated effectively and safely so that no harm may fall into them or anyone else. If a person is not an uncontrollable threat, they can be sent to an outpatient mental health center where they just attend 4 to 6 hours per day of treatment, then get to go home.
Thank you, and good night.